It was a sunny afternoon in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where manicured lawns and white picket fences painted a picture of peace and harmony. But for the tenants of apartment 3B, peace was a distant memory. The Smith family, a hard-working black family who had lived in the complex for 2 years, had recently become the target of their landlord, Mr. Grayson. Mr. Grayson was a man known for his sharp suits, sour demeanor, and thinly veiled prejudices. His disdain for the Smiths was no secret. He made it known through late-night noise complaints, sudden maintenance inspections, and thinly veiled threats to raise their rent beyond affordability. The Smiths endured it with grace, knowing that moving wasn't an option in a housing market that catered to anyone but them. On this particular day, Mr. Grayson's irritation boiled over when he saw the Smith children playing with chalk on the driveway, drawing rainbows and hopscotch grids. "Defacing property," he muttered under his breath as he pulled out his phone. His fingers dialed 911 with the confidence of a man who believed the system would always be on his side. "Hello, officer? I need you to come immediately. My tenants are causing trouble again," Mr. Grayson growled into the phone, careful not to mention the Smiths race, but letting his tone carry the implication. Within minutes, the wail of a siren broke the neighborhood's calm. Mrs. Smith stood on the porch, her heart racing as she watched the patrol car pull up. Her husband, Marcus, joined her, his jaw tight with worry. "Stay calm," he whispered, though his own nerves were on edge. They had seen enough news stories to know how these encounters could end. As the officer stepped out of the car, Mr. Grayson strode toward him, exuding confidence. "Glad you're here, officer. These people have been a constant headache. Look at what they've done." He gestured wildly at the chalk drawings, as though they were graffiti on a city wall. The Smiths braced themselves, expecting the usual script to play out, the officer taking Mr. Grayson's side without question. But what happened next would leave everyone stunned. The officer's calm demeanor was a stark contrast to Mr. Grayson's agitation. Tall and composed, with a badge that gleamed in the sunlight, Officer Daniels surveyed the scene with measured eyes. His gaze shifted from the chalk drawings to the Smith family standing silently by their porch. "These are the markings you're concerned about?" Officer Daniels asked, pointing to the colorful rainbows and games etched onto the driveway. "Yes. This is private property," Mr. Grayson huffed. "It's vandalism, and I won't stand for it." The officer's lips pressed into a thin line. He knelt, running a hand over the harmless chalk marks that would vanish with the next rain. Slowly, he stood up and dusted off his hands. "Looks like kids being kids to me," he said evenly. Mr. Grayson's face turned red. "That's not the point. They've been a nuisance. Loud music, disrespecting the property. This is the last straw." Mrs. Smith took a cautious step forward. "We've followed all the rules, officer," she said softly. "Our kids were just playing. We clean up after them every time. This isn't about the chalk, is it?" Marcus clenched his fists but remained silent, determined not to escalate the situation. Officer Daniels's eyes flicked between the landlord and the family. "Let's talk facts," he said firmly. "Have there been any official complaints filed about this family?" "Well, no, but I've warned them plenty of times." Mr. Grayson snapped. Daniels took out his notepad. "Warnings without cause don't hold up legally, sir. And calling the police over something like this seems like a waste of resources." The Smiths exchanged glances, unsure whether to believe what they were hearing. Mr. Grayson sputtered. "Are you taking their side? They're the problem here." Daniels's expression hardened. "I'm here to ensure the law is followed, not to pick sides. And right now, I don't see a legal issue. Just a landlord trying to intimidate his tenants." The landlord's bravado wavered. "This is outrageous. I pay taxes. I expect support from law enforcement." Daniels's voice remained steady. "And I serve this community, which includes the Smiths. I suggest you rethink how you handle situations like this." As the officer spoke, a few neighbors gathered at their windows, curious about the unfolding scene. Mrs. Smith noticed them and felt the weight of judgment lift ever so slightly. For once, they weren't the ones under scrutiny. The officer turned back to the Smiths. "Sorry for the trouble, folks. Keep enjoying your afternoon." Marcus nodded, his voice rough with gratitude. "Thank you, officer." As Daniels walked back to his car, Mr. Grayson followed, seething. "You'll regret this," he hissed under his breath. Daniels stopped in his tracks. "Consider this a friendly warning, Mr. Grayson. Harassment and discrimination are illegal. Keep that in mind." The Smiths watched as Mr. Grayson's shoulders sagged, his confidence visibly shaken. For the first time, someone had stood up to him, and it wasn't who he expected. The officer's unexpected stance wasn't just a relief. It was a spark of hope. The Smiths weren't alone in this fight, and that changed everything. The neighborhood returned to its usual calm, but the tension lingered. The Smith family knew this wouldn't be the end of Mr. Grayson's antics. Yet, Officer Daniels' intervention had shifted the dynamic. It was rare to see a law enforcement officer challenge someone like Grayson, and the Smiths were determined to hold on to that small victory. A few days later, Marcus sat at the dining table, reviewing documents related to their lease agreement. "He's bound to come up with something new," Marcus said grimly. "We need to be prepared." Mrs. Smith nodded. "We should reach out to someone. Maybe a lawyer?" As fate would have it, Officer Daniels wasn't done with the case either. His curiosity had been piqued by the landlord's behavior. Back at the precinct, he began digging into Grayson's record, suspecting there was more to the story than a simple complaint over chalk drawings. Daniels' search revealed a pattern: multiple tenant complaints, predominantly from Black and minority families, all mysteriously leaving the property within months. Grayson had never been formally reported, but the pattern was clear: intimidation and subtle discrimination masked as strict property management. "This guy's walking a fine line," Daniels muttered under his breath. He decided to pay a visit to the local housing authority. Meanwhile, word of the officer's unusual response spread through the neighborhood. One afternoon, a neighbor, Mrs. Patel, approached the Smiths as they tended to their garden. "I saw what happened the other day," she said, glancing around cautiously. "You're not the only ones he's tried to push out. He did the same to my cousin's family last year." Mrs. Smith's brows furrowed. "What happened to them?" "They moved out," Mrs. Patel sighed. "It was easier than fighting him. But maybe now, with that officer on your side, things will be different." Encouraged by the conversation, the Smiths decided to contact a tenant rights group. They shared their experiences and learned that Grayson's tactics weren't just unethical, they bordered on illegal. When Officer Daniels returned to the Smiths' home, they were ready. "We've been doing some investigating too," Marcus said, showing Daniels a folder of complaints and testimonies from previous tenants. Daniels flipped through the pages, nodding. "This matches what I found. He's been operating under the radar for too long. I think it's time we bring this to light." Together, they crafted a formal complaint backed by evidence. Daniels promised to follow up with the housing authority and ensure the Smiths wouldn't face retaliation. The investigation gained traction quickly. With Daniels' credibility and the Smiths' determination, Grayson was suddenly facing scrutiny from both legal authorities and the community. One morning, a news crew showed up outside the complex. "We've heard reports of discrimination and harassment at this property. Care to comment?" a reporter asked Grayson as he tried to dodge the cameras. Flustered, Grayson muttered, "This is all nonsense. My record speaks for itself." But his record was exactly what was being dismantled piece by piece. Tenants past and present came forward, emboldened by the Smiths' stand. As the pieces of the investigation came together, it became clear that this wasn't just about one family or one landlord. It was a turning point for a community long silenced by fear. The pressure on Mr. Grayson mounted with each passing day. The Smiths' formal complaint, combined with testimonies from past tenants, created a case too strong for the housing authority to ignore. Grayson, once smug and untouchable, now faced legal action for discriminatory practices and tenant harassment. The community rallied behind the Smiths, who had become symbols of resilience and justice. Neighbors who had once remained silent now spoke openly about their experiences. Mrs. Patel's cousin filed her own complaint, recounting how Grayson had forced her family out through constant harassment disguised as property management concerns. One bright morning, a court notice was delivered to Grayson's office. The housing authority had initiated proceedings to strip him of his landlord privileges and impose fines for multiple violations. His expression, usually haughty, was grim as he read the document. At the Smiths' home, The mood was hopeful but cautious. "It's not over yet," Marcus reminded his family. "We need to see this through." Officer Daniels remained a steadfast ally, attending hearings and providing testimony about the incident that had sparked the entire investigation. "I saw firsthand how Mr. Grayson tried to misuse law enforcement to intimidate the Smiths," Daniels stated firmly in court. "That kind of abuse of power has no place in our community." The judge's verdict was clear and decisive. Grayson was ordered to pay damages to several former tenants, including the Smiths. More importantly, he was barred from managing any rental properties for the foreseeable future. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered to capture the aftermath. Mrs. Smith spoke on behalf of the family. "This victory isn't just for us. It's for every family who's ever been treated unfairly because of who they are. We hope this sends a message. Discrimination has no place in our neighborhoods." The news spread quickly, igniting conversations about tenant rights and racial discrimination in housing. The Smiths' courage, combined with Officer Daniels' integrity, had sparked a transformation that extended beyond their neighborhood. Back at the complex, changes were already taking shape. A new property management company took over, implementing fair and transparent policies. The atmosphere felt lighter, freer, as neighbors mingled without the oppressive presence of Grayson looming over them. Daniels visited the Smiths one last time. "Looks like things are finally turning around," he said with a smile. "Thanks to you," Marcus said, shaking the officer's hand. "Thanks to all of us," Daniels corrected. This was a team effort. As the Smith children played on the driveway, their chalk drawings brighter than ever, Mrs. Smith watched with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. "We finally have our home back," she said softly. Months passed, and life at the apartment complex settled into a new rhythm, one defined by respect, fairness, and a renewed sense of community. The Smith family, once unsure of their place, now felt firmly rooted. Their story had become a beacon of hope, not just for their neighborhood, but for countless others facing similar battles across the city. The aftermath of the case brought tangible changes. The Housing Authority implemented stricter guidelines to protect tenants from harassment and discrimination. A hotline was established for renters to report unethical landlord behavior, ensuring that cases like Grayson's would be addressed swiftly and transparently. Officer Daniels received commendation from both his department and community organizations for his integrity and courage in standing up against injustice. His decision to support the Smiths had not only defused a tense situation, but also set a powerful precedent for how law enforcement could serve and protect without bias. As for Mr. Grayson, his fall from power was swift and humiliating. Stripped of his landlord privileges, he faded from public view, a cautionary tale for those who thought they could wield power without accountability. One sunny afternoon, the Smiths hosted a block party, something unimaginable during Grayson's reign. Music filled the air, children played freely, and neighbors mingled without fear. Mrs. Patel and her family brought samosas, while Marcus manned the grill. Officer Daniels even stopped by, much to the delight of the neighborhood kids who bombarded him with questions about his patrol car. Mrs. Smith stood on the porch, watching the joyful scene unfold. Marcus joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "We've come a long way," he said. "And we're not done yet," Mrs. Smith replied with a smile. "But this is a start." Later that evening, as the party wound down, Mrs. Smith took a quiet moment to reflect. They had faced fear, prejudice, and uncertainty, but they had emerged stronger. The fight had been worth it, not just for their family but for the entire community. Looking up at the sky, she whispered a silent vow to continue advocating for justice and equality. Their story was proof that change was possible, even in the face of deep-seated prejudice. As the last rays of sunlight faded, the chalk drawings on the driveway stood out boldly against the pavement, bright, beautiful symbols of resilience, unity, and hope.